Right now, your brain is sitting in total darkness, locked inside a box of bone, soaking in fluid, receiving nothing but faint electrical crackles from the outside world. It has never seen a sunset, never heard a voice, never tasted anything. It's about the weight of a small melon and the softness of warm custard, and somehow, out of those crackles, it is building the entire room you think you're in. Over the next 20 minutes, you'll understand how 3 pounds of wet tissue constructs your whole reality, why a man took an iron rod clean through the skull and survived but lost himself, and why you can physically rebuild your own brain just by choosing what to pay attention to. Here's the part that should bother you a little. The world you're seeing right now isn't out there. It's in here. And your brain has been guessing the whole time. A neuroscience degree takes 4 years and around $160,000. This takes 20 minutes. Welcome to Skip the Degree. Start with a problem that took a Nobel Prize and a bitter feud to solve. In the late 1800s, scientists could finally see brain tissue under a microscope thanks to a silver stain invented by an Italian named Camillo Golgi. Golgi looked at the tangle and concluded the obvious thing. The brain is one continuous web, a single fused network. Wires all the way down. He was wrong, and the man who proved it used Golgi's own stain to do it. Santiago Ramon y Cajal was a Spanish kid from a small town in Aragon who wanted to be a painter. As a boy, he was such a troublemaker that he once built a homemade cannon and blew the gate off a neighbor's garden and got himself thrown in jail at age 11. His father, a country surgeon with rough hands and no patience for art, beat the ambition out of him and pushed him toward medicine. So Cajal did the only logical thing. He became a doctor who painted neurons. Night after night, he sat hunched over the same kind of microscope as Golgi, drawing what he saw by hand in ink so precise the drawings still hang in museums more than a century later. And he saw something Golgi flatly refused to see. The brain isn't one fused web. It's billions of separate cells, individual units not quite touching. Golgi never forgave him for it. In 1906, the two men were forced to share the very same Nobel Prize, stood on the same stage in Stockholm, and used their own acceptance speeches to publicly tear each other's theories to shreds. The inventor of the stain, defending the wrong answer with the exact tool that had just buried it, that tiny gap between two neurons has a name, the synapse. And it changes everything because it means your brain isn't a circuit board, it's a crowd. Billions of separate cells shouting across billions of tiny gaps, and somehow the shouting is you. So what's actually crossing that gap? Not a thought, not a feeling, salt. When a neuron fires, it isn't being poetic. Charged particles, sodium and potassium, rush across the cell's membrane in a wave, a tiny voltage spike that races down the neuron at up to 120 meters a second, fast enough to cross a football field before you finish blinking. And it's all or nothing. A neuron doesn't whisper or murmur, it's a trigger, not a dimmer switch. It fires at full strength or it stays silent. When the spike reaches the end, the cell squirts chemicals across the gap, neurotransmitters that tell the next cell whether to fire or shut up. That's it. That's the physical event sitting underneath every thought you have ever had. Salt moving, chemicals squirting, roughly 100 trillion times across a single lifetime. Now scale it. You carry around 86 billion of these neurons. Each one can connect to as many as 10,000 others. Do that multiplication, and you get more connections inside your skull than there are stars in the entire Milky Way, by a factor of thousands. If you tried to count your neurons 1 per second, you'd be counting for over 2,700 years. Lay all the wiring inside a single brain end to end, and there's enough of it to circle the entire planet several times over. The single, most complex structure we have ever found anywhere in the known universe is sitting behind your eyes, and you've been using it mostly to win arguments and forget where you left your keys. Which brings us back to the darkness, because here's the idea that breaks people the first time they really get it. Your brain does not show you the world. It can't. It's sealed in the skull with no direct line to anything. All it ever receives is the crackle, nerve signals from eyes and ears and skin. From that alone, it has to guess what's out there. And it guesses ahead of time. You think you see first, then understand. Backwards. Your brain predicts what should be there, builds the image, and only uses your senses to check its own work and patch the errors. When you walk into your kitchen, you don't really see your kitchen. You see your brain's expectation of your kitchen, lightly corrected by photons. Perception isn't a window. It's a controlled hallucination that happens to line up with reality most of the time. Want proof you can feel? You have a literal hole in your vision, in each eye, where the optic nerve punches through the retina. No light-sensing cells there at all. A blank spot the size of 9 full moons sitting in your field of view right now. You have never once noticed it because your brain quietly paints over the gap with its best guess of what should be there and hands you a smooth, seamless picture that is partly invented. You are not seeing a whole. You are seeing a forgery, and you trust it completely. And when the guessing stops lining up, things get strange. Hold that thought, because for 2,000 years, nobody knew any of this was physical at all. Then a railroad accident in Vermont changed the question forever. It's September 13, 1848. Phineas Gage is 25 years old, a railroad foreman, well-liked, dependable, the man his crew trusts to handle the explosives. He's tamping blasting powder into a hole with an iron rod, 3 feet 7 inches long, an inch and a quarter thick, 13.5 pounds. The powder ignites early. The rod launches like a javelin, enters under his left cheekbone, passes behind his eye, and exits clean through the top of his skull, landing 25 meters away, smeared with brain. He doesn't die. He doesn't even stay unconscious for long. Within minutes, he's sitting up and talking. Within months, he's walking around town, carrying the very rod that went through his head, which he kept for the rest of his life and called his constant companion. Today, it sits in a glass case at Harvard, right next to his skull. But the Phineas who walked away was not the Phineas who showed up to work that morning. The reliable, courteous foreman was gone. In his place came a man who was profane, impulsive, unable to hold a plan or keep a promise. His friends said simply that he was no longer Gage. The rod had torn through much of his frontal lobe, and it had taken his personality with it. This was the moment the soul became geography. Because here's what Gage proved by accident in the worst way imaginable. Who you are has an address. Your patience, your foresight, your ability to not say the thing you're thinking, all of it lives in a specific neighborhood of tissue just behind your forehead. Damage the neighborhood, lose the trait. The personality isn't floating in some ghostly elsewhere. It's wet, it's local, and it can be rearranged by enough force and a genuinely terrible day at work. And it wasn't a one-off. A few years later, in 1861, a French doctor named Pierre-Paul Broca met a patient at the hospital called Tan, because Tan was very nearly the only sound the man could still make. He understood everything said to him. He just couldn't get words out. When the man died, Broca opened his skull and found a single damaged patch on the left side of the brain toward the front. That patch now carries his name, Broca's area. One specific lump of tissue the size of a large coin, and without it, the entire machinery of speech jams. Gage gave us the personality's address. Tan gave us language's address. The map of the mind was being drawn, one tragedy at a time. A century later, that principle got a far more precise and far more haunting proof. His name was Henry Molaison, though for 50 years the textbooks only ever called him H.M. He was 27, crippled by seizures so severe he could barely function, and in 1953 a surgeon removed a slug of tissue from deep inside both halves of his brain, a seahorse-shaped structure called the hippocampus, hoping to stop them. It worked, the seizures eased, and Henry never formed a single new memory again, not for the next 55 years. Every person he met after that operation, he met for the first time, every time. The researcher who studied him for decades had to reintroduce herself at every single visit. He'd read the same magazine with genuine fresh interest over and over and over. He was, in a sense, frozen at 27, living inside a present moment that never accumulated into a past. When he finally died in 2008, his brain was frozen, sliced into 2,401 paper-thin sections, and photographed in a procedure streamed live online for anyone to watch. The most studied patient in the history of the field, examined to the last micrometer. But here's the finding that rewired the entire science of memory. They gave Henry a tricky task, tracing the outline of a star while watching his hand only in a mirror. It's awkward for anyone. And day after day, Henry got steadily better at it, smoother, faster. His hands were clearly learning, but every single day he swore on his life he had never seen the task before. So memory is not one thing, it's at least two. There's the memory of facts and events, the kind Henry lost on the operating table. And there's the memory of skills, the kind his hands quietly kept, running in a completely separate system the scalpel never touched. You're using both right now. One knows your name. The other knows how to ride a bike, and they barely speak to each other. If that sounds like a 1 in a million case, it isn't. Consider Clive Waring, a brilliant British conductor who, in 1985, caught a virus that ate through his hippocampus. His memory now lasts somewhere between 7 and 30 seconds. He keeps a diary that reads, line after crossed out line, I am now awake for the first time. I am now truly awake. Each entry erasing the last, a man waking up forever. And yet sit him at a piano, and he plays flawlessly. Conduct and his choir follows. Hand him sheet music written decades ago, and his fingers remember every note his mind cannot. The skills survived the wreck, the facts did not. Same split Henry showed us, written in an even harsher hand. Step back for a second. Notice what just happened across these stories. We didn't learn that the brain is complicated. Everyone already says that. We learned something stranger. The brain is plural. It isn't one mind sitting in one place. It's many systems in many places, stitched together into the feeling of a single you. And that feeling that you are one thing might be the most convincing illusion the whole machine produces. For most of the 20th century, scientists believed the adult brain was finished, fixed. You got your neurons in childhood, and from there it was a slow downhill slide. The wiring was set in concrete. Then somebody scanned a few taxi drivers. To drive a black cab in London, you have to pass an exam, so punishing it has its own name. The knowledge. You must memorize 25,000 streets and thousands of landmarks across a 6-mile radius and exactly how they connect until you can plot any route in your head on the spot. It takes the average driver 3 to 4 years of obsessive study, and most people who started quit. When the neuroscientist Eleanor Maguire scanned the ones who passed, she found something that should have been impossible. The rear of their hippocampus, that same memory structure Henry lost, was physically larger than in the rest of us, and the longer they'd been driving, the bigger it had grown. They didn't start out with bigger brains. They built them by learning. And there was a twist, the kind the textbooks love. The front of that same structure had shrunk a little, as if the brain had borrowed space from one job to pour into another. Growth, with a bill attached. And it isn't just cab drivers. Scan professional violinists and you find the patch of brain that maps the fingers of their left hand. The hand that flies across the strings has expanded into neighboring territory, larger the younger they started. The map of your own body inside your head is redrawn by what you practice. This is neuroplasticity, and it is the single most personally relevant fact in this entire video. Your brain is not a fixed object, it is a verb. Every skill you practice, every fear you rehearse, every language you pick up, every doom scroll you repeat physically reshapes the tissue. Neurons that fire together, wire together, whatever you do over and over, you become more efficient at right down at the level of the wetware. Which means the things you repeat aren't just habits, they're construction. So here's where everything we've covered collides into a single picture. 3 ways of seeing the thing inside your skull that you can actually carry out of this video and use. Here's the first lens. Your brain is a prediction engine. Everything we said about controlled hallucination wasn't a quirk. It's the whole operating principle. The brain is constantly running a model of the world, betting on what comes next, then using reality to settle the bet. The second-order consequence is enormous. Most of what you experience is generated from the inside out. This is why optical illusions work. Your prediction overrides the actual photons hitting your eye. It's why 2 people watch the same argument and walk away remembering 2 completely different fights. And it goes deeper than seeing. It reaches into your body. When a doctor hands you a sugar pill and you expect relief, your pain genuinely drops because your brain predicted relief and released its own painkillers to match the forecast. That's the placebo effect, and it's not in your imagination, it's in your chemistry. And the prediction doesn't stop at perception, it bleeds into memory. Every time you recall something, your brain doesn't replay a recording, it rebuilds the scene from scratch and quietly edits it to fit what you expect now. Which is why confident eyewitnesses, certain beyond doubt, have sent innocent people to prison for decades on memories that turned out to be partly manufactured. The most dangerous sentence in a courtroom is "I'll never forget that face." Which means the next time you are certain, absolutely certain, about exactly what you saw or felt, you might hold that certainty a little more loosely. You weren't recording, you were guessing. You just usually guess well enough to get away with it. The second lens cuts deeper. Your brain is editable, and you are the editor. Plasticity isn't a charming fact about cab drivers and violinists, it's the mechanism behind every change you've ever made in your life. The London driver grew his hippocampus by pouring attention into streets. You are doing the exact same thing to yourself right now with whatever you happen to pour your attention into, and the consequence runs both directions, which is the part that should keep you honest. Practice a skill, and you carve a faster road for it through the tissue. Rehearse a worry at 3 in the morning and you carve that road too. Because anxiety is, in part, a very well-practiced neural habit. And once a groove is deep enough, it starts pulling you back into it on its own, which is exactly what addiction is at the level of wiring, a path worn so smooth the brain slides down it without asking. It runs the other way too. The brain is ruthless about deleting what you stop using, pruning away the connections you neglect to save energy, which is why a language you don't speak fades, why a skill rusts. Use it or lose it isn't a motivational poster, it's a maintenance policy your neurons enforce whether you like it or not, which means the most consequential thing you own is not your time and not your money. It's your attention. Wherever it goes, the wiring follows, and then the wiring starts choosing for you. And then there's the third lens, the one that genuinely unsettles people. There is no single you in there. We've seen it 3 times already. Gage lost his personality but kept his memory. Henry lost his memory but kept his skills. Clive lost almost everything but kept the music in his hands. Surgeons have even cut the bridge between the 2 halves of the brain and watched a single patient's 2 hands openly disagree with each other, one reaching to button a shirt while the other unbuttons it. Nowhere in all 86 billion neurons is there a tiny control room where the real you sits, watching the show on a screen. The self isn't a location. It's what it feels like from the inside when billions of separate systems happen to sync up well enough to act as one. The second-order consequence is the strangest claim in this entire field. The unified person you call me is something your brain performs, moment to moment, not something it stores in a drawer. And we know it can be switched off because anesthesia does it every day, dimming that performance down to nothing and back up again. The same you walking out of the operating room as the one who walked in, picked up mid-sentence as if nothing had paused, and the borders of that self are far looser than they feel. Hide your hand, set a rubber one in its place, have someone stroke both in perfect sync, and within a minute, your brain adopts the fake as your own, flinching when a hammer swings toward it. The line between you and not you turns out to be just another prediction, and it can be rewritten in under 60 seconds. Remember the question we opened with. How does a lump of tissue locked in the dark build an entire world? Now you have the answer in 3 moves. It predicts the world before it arrives. It rewires itself to predict a little better next time. And it stitches the whole result into the seamless, convincing feeling of one person looking out through 2 eyes. Your reality, in the most literal sense, is an inside job. You now understand the synapse and the salt that crosses it, why Phineas Gage and a patient called Tan proved your personality and your speech each have a physical address, how Henry Molaison split memory into separate systems running side by side, and why the same brain that predicts your world can rewire itself on command. That's 4 years of a neuroscience degree, the cells, the breakdowns, the plasticity, and the uncomfortable truth that there's no one home but the machine. In 20 minutes. Skip the degree. It's a strange thing to sit with for a moment. The organ you're using to understand this sentence is the very same organ the sentence is about. The knife trying to cut itself. For all our scans and silver stains and Nobel feuds, the brain stays the one place in the known universe where the map and the territory are made of the same stuff, where the thing being studied and the thing doing the studying are one and the same lump of custard in the dark. 3 pounds of it sealed away from the light, quietly doing the arithmetic of a universe it will never directly touch. You're not just reading about the experiment, you are the experiment. And it's still running. If your brain just rewired itself a little, built a couple of fresh connections, carved a slightly deeper groove around the word synapse, then it did the precise thing we spent 20 minutes saying it does. That's the whole pitch. Subscribe, and you keep feeding it the one signal it was built to consume, a pattern worth predicting. Every discipline we take apart in here leaves a mark on the tissue. The next one is already forming, somewhere behind your eyes. Press the prediction, see what fires.